Well, welcome everybody. It's a delight to be here today and to honour the late Ambassador Chris Stevens, who was a close personal friend. I'm pleased that members of the family are here and that we have such great attendance today. My talk today is focused on the Gulf states, essentially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and what's been happening over what has been an extremely busy summer and a number of events which still unfold in an unscripted fashion. So you know, the region is as complex as ever, but if there's a narrative arc to everything that I've got to say to you today, it is that as it moves through a post-ISIS phase, there are a number of, which is imminent and upon us. There are a number of stakeholders which are, you know, looking to shape the environment moving forward, and a number of things are in play which the trajectory of which are a little bit uncertain. And of course, where the US lines up in all of this is of critical interest. So how am I going to? I've thought to myself, how can I possibly, you know, communicate all of this complexity in a way that doesn't have you, bored, overwhelmed? And I was thinking about this while I was swimming in San Francisco Bay, and went into the sauna at the Dolphin Club, which is a long-established club in the city. And with me in the sauna was Joe Illich, who's an 80-year-old retired professor of history. He worked on American history at San Francisco State, and we're really good friends. And Joe was talking about his disappointment with the Summer of Love exhibition at the Young Museum over the summer. And I said, well, what was wrong with it, Joe? And he said, you know, he said, I thought with all of that celebration of sex, drugs and rock and roll, they would have somehow made it more exciting. And I said, well, Joe, he's 80, I said, sounds like you wanted something more interactive. He said, yeah, I would like something more interactive. So, of course, we made something more interactive for some of the subject matter we're dealing with today. It would probably be a bit of a kinetic experience. However, what I'm going to try and do is tell the story through videos, cartoons, other people's words, and then just sort of direct a commentary in that regard and point out a few trends, etc. And then we can have a discussion after that. And so we'll start off with a clip from the inaugural trip abroad of the current President of the United States. And his first trip was to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in May, which kicked off a chain of events in relation to the Saudi-Qatar relationship. So we'll watch that clip, I'll give a few words and we'll move on to the next one.
This is the war dance. I can see that. You got it.
Oh, God.
Always the right hand, right?
Okay, so a couple of things to point out there from that clip, the first visit, as I said, and some of you may have picked up some of the characters in there. But just to the left of the president is the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, who is visibly ailing here. And you can see he couldn't hold up his sword, and it was very difficult for him to go through the protocol, etc. And what I want to point out to you here is that what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia right now is a historic succession process. Where you have in Saudi Arabia traditionally, the passage of from one king to the next has gone laterally along sibling to sibling. And here you've got a process where King Salman is preparing the ground for his own son, Mohammed bin Salman, to take over the crown. And this has been a process that has been 2 years in the making, since January 2015, with the passing of King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz. And it has been fraught internally, domestically, with other branches of the royal family. And it's also led to, I would argue, some rather interesting foreign policy choices by King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman in this period, partly as a way to disguise or deflect attention away from what has been happening domestically within the kingdom. Okay, so this process is in train now, and I'll show what happens after President Trump visits, of course, outside the commercial deals and so on and so forth, is that very quickly the Gulf states led by Saudi and the UAE start accusing Qatar of a broad range of faults and foreign policy choices, and quickly enact a blockade on the Gulf state. Unprecedented, that blockade continues until this day, it is a real, issue, and it could see the collapse of the Gulf Cooperation Council in the context that, as with an arrangement that's existed since 1981. So there's a seismic challenge here to part of the cartography of the region, and the question, of course, is why Saudi and the UAE in particular, but also Bahrain, Egypt, and a few others are engaging in this way with Qatar. Now, to a certain extent, the US administration was blindsided by this and did not anticipate what was coming. What seemed like initial approval or agreement from the president was very quickly dispelled by the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, of course, who was here having a great time in Riyadh. Now, Rex Tillerson is an interesting character, of course, because in his former job he was a CEO of ExxonMobil, and he knows the Gulf states very well, of course. And so in the previous decade, in his role as CEO, his company, along with BP, almost between the two of them, basically took Qatar, in terms of its gas producing capacity down here, into the world leader that it is today. So Tillerson is someone who knows the Qatari royal family better than anybody else. And so he's in Washington trying to work out what on earth the Saudis are up to with Qatar, because he doesn't understand quite what the argument is. So this leads to a bit of dissonance in Washington in reacting to this, but very quickly the US calls the Saudis to account, defends the Qataris, but nonetheless the blockade still exists today. And I'll just show another quick clip of the Emir of come back to this question of what is it that the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular were really upset with Qatar about. In this long list of accusations essentially boils down to three things. One is that Qatar has had a very independent foreign policy right across the region since the early 2000s. When they drew up their own basic law and constitution in 2003, there's an article that identifies them and their role in the region as the regional mediator. And so that's the way they position themselves, and depending on how you see it, very wealthy, they have a vision of the region from their perspective, everyone should be, it should be an inclusive place, everyone should be spoken to, they don't care if you're labelled a terrorist or not, they're there. Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Djibouti, Eritrea, Yemen, etc. And they've been doing this relentlessly for a decade or so, and it's been annoying the other Gulf states immensely who see themselves in having a leadership role in the region. So that's the first point. They didn't want Qatar, and they don't want Qatar moving forward to maintain an independent foreign policy separate to themselves. The second issue that they took most offence at was that Qatar had, in particular in the context of the Arab Spring and the political transitions that emerged in all of the countries subsequently, had supported the Muslim Brotherhood, political parties that emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood social movement in each of the countries. And from the Qatari perspective, they saw this as an opportunity to gain influence right across the region. And of course, many other countries and players saw this as outright interference in the internal affairs of state. And this has been a repeat accusation from 2011 to 2012. It reached a crescendo of anger, particularly after President Morsi was elected President of Egypt in the middle of 2012. And where the complexions of the region suddenly looked like it would change. And of course that stopped with the sort of counter-revolutionary forces that sought to put an end to these political transitions, or where particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis and others sponsored forces outside Muslim Brotherhood and regimes that would emerge separately. So that remains a key point of concern between and among the Gulf states. And then the final one, of course, is this question of Al Jazeera, which has never gone away, and which in its moments of genuine independence has been, in the English language at least, honest, independent broadcaster and cover of media right across the region. In Arabic, completely different story, particularly after 2012, 2013, where positive coverage of the Muslim Brotherhood and negative coverage of those other forces became a reality. Now, And so the Saudis and Emiratis in particular want, frankly, to see editorial interference on Al Jazeera to stop and its broadcasting to change. One of the reasons why they're particularly interested in this happening in the period moving forward comes back to this question of it being related to the Saudi succession, and where Mohammed bin Salman, having been named Crown Prince, has also developed Vision 2030 for the future of the country, where in the context of great economic challenges in terms of their population outstripping the ability of them to pump enough oil to provide the same degree of benefits to their citizens, and having to economically diversify the country, they're facing a crunch time where they have to change the economic structures of the country, for which nobody is prepared. And this is requiring to also change what has been a fairly conservative country into a place that is more open, potentially more pluralistic, has greater opportunities for women, driving, participation, etc. And if you think about the Dubai model and where the Emiratis have gone in terms of being a cosmopolitan hub and a country that's embraced globalization, etc., the Saudis are moving in that direction, or this is Mohammed bin Salman's vision, which places him at great risk internally. And so this question of positive coverage and Al Jazeera and Qatar interference becomes very, very important. So my point to you, I guess, is that of all of the many reasons that the Saudis and the Emiratis have put this blockade on Qatar, these are the three main ones in my view. And the question is, will this be enough? So let me just digress with a couple of cartoons and talk a little bit about Yemen and the beginning of the Saudi succession. And this story takes us back to March 2015.
Yes.
And, the cartoon up the top, can you all read that? Is, the Yemenis saying, what on earth have we done to, or what's happening to us right now? And this conflict which started in March 2015, which was a Saudi-led coalition attack on a number of the parties in Yemen, the Houthi-Salah alliance. Operation Decisive Storm, which was meant to last 2 weeks, has now been going for 2.5 years. And the situation in Yemen officially today is the world's worst humanitarian crisis out there. And the bar is very low, of course, in these tragic circumstances. So the nearly 1 million people with cholera, the total disintegration of services across the country, fragmentation of all parties, and then frankly the expansion of Al-Qaeda and other groups as a consequence. But this war ends up being the first real expeditionary offensive by the Saudis and the Emiratis. The Emirates are in a position of almost occupying the south of the country, and the Saudis are managing out of Riyadh through an operations room all of the air offensives in the country. And of course, the United States is providing air-to-air refueling, intelligence targeting, etc., as is the UK. And in both countries, there have been challenges to this blanket assistance to the Saudis because of the nature, indiscriminate nature, frankly, of how the war is being prosecuted, and it's just huge impact. But what happens here in March 2015, this is 2 months after the death of King Abdulaziz, is King Salman takes the first step in a succession plan by anointing his son, which is to his left, Mohammed bin Salman, as the deputy crown prince. Now the first crown prince is Mohammed bin Nayef, who is a security intelligence Ministry of the Interior for a decade in Saudi Arabia, very experienced and very close to the West in many ways. as the crown prince. But Mohammed bin Salman gets given a whole range of portfolios, including responsibility for the war in Yemen and responsibilities for structurally changing some of the institutions in Saudi, including over time developing Vision 2030 and so on and so forth. So that he's, in effect, you know, everyone knows he's very powerful, that he's the new man coming up. And the question is, when is he going to become the crown prince and therefore the next in line? Now, we saw that King Salman in the first video was very weak, and he in fact could either abdicate, step aside, or in fact pass away at any time. And so King Mohammed bin Salman could in fact become the king of Saudi Arabia very shortly. But this internal change and shuffle happens just as the war in Yemen begins. And so what I'm saying to you is that there's a correlation between what, for most external observers, was a really stupid decision to go to war in Yemen, but while they do that, this reshuffle is happening domestically. And of course, when we step back again to President Trump's visit to Riyadh in May, the blockade on Qatar, what follows very quickly is the second part of the succession plan, whereby Mohammed bin Salman replaces Mohammed bin Nayef. So while everyone's looking at Qatar, you have this final change happening on the domestic front. And the way that this happens is that Mohammed bin Nayef suddenly gets asked, or gets put under house arrest in his own home, and he gets a visit from Mohammed bin Salman, and they have a cup of coffee. And Mohammed bin Salman gives Mohammed bin Nayef an offer that he can't refuse. And at about 5 o'clock in the morning, Mohammed bin Nayef agrees to step aside from being the crown prince, and Mohammed bin Salman gets a job. And I'll just show you how that plays out. Okay, so as I said, that paves the way now that he's the crown prince to become the king of Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting about this succession, which took 2 years to actually play out, is that this is not just a question of passing the baton from Mohammed bin Nayef to Mohammed bin Salman, but it is actually a very serious structural overhaul of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so that at the governor level, the provincial level, across all of the ministries of government, you've got a new cohort of young men in their mid-30s predominantly, who have taken over from the old guard. And it's strategic. I would say that it's consolidated. It's not weak, but it's in place. And it took 2 years to work their way through this. In the context of domestic internal turmoil. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a wave of arrests within Saudi Arabia, where some clerics, some princes, and some kind of senior thought leaders in a way, outside of government, were arrested, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't say. And what they didn't say was pledging of allegiance to the Crown Prince publicly, and what they didn't say was support for the policies against Qatar and the blockade, which not all Saudis agreed with. But these young men are now in charge, and they could be in charge for a long time. And it also correlates with a relatively young leadership in the United Arab Emirates also, with whom they're working in step. So we have a successful transition. But of course, Mohammed bin Salman has still got this issue to deal with, And while there's every indication that the Saudis are suddenly saying, oh my goodness, we need a way out of this, the question is how to get out of what is a terrible quagmire. And there's no press allowed into Yemen, there's no coverage. Everything all the airspace is controlled through Riyadh, and it's a pretty shocking state of affairs. And it's also having the impact, of course, of having a massive impact on you know, draining the coffers in Saudi Arabia. It's an expensive business, so their external reserves have dropped by a couple of $100 billion over the last couple of years, you know, partly in paying for the transition and partly for paying for the war in Yemen. And it's in this context that, as part of the Vision 2030 plan, the Saudis are talking about for the first time selling 5% of their national oil company, Aramco, which they're hoping to secure about $100 billion for it, which would mean that Saudi Aramco would be capitalised around about a value of $1 trillion. So, you know, the question is how to do this. If they float this as an IPO on the US stock exchange, they could be exposed to claims by people who are suing them in relation to the 9/11 attacks. That legislation is sitting in the president's, US President's office right now, stuck there. But the other thing they'd have to do is they'd have to come clean and open and transparent about what the extent of their reserves are. People are not going to invest and buy unless they have a clear idea of the oil and gas reserves. And this, of course, is a fairly opaque business at the best of times in most places. So the Saudis are under a little bit of pressure. Having secured the throne, almost, there's I said there's a correlation between silly external decisions masking internal domestic strife. Is there a possibility that the policies will become, you know, a little bit more coherent moving forward? That's a story that remains to be seen. Now, of course, we can't talk about the Gulf states right now without having to talk about Iran here. And this is probably the most politicized, almost ideological question we have right now. And I just want to play a couple of clips. Which
it is a profound honor to stand here in my home city as a representative of the American people. Recently held two unanimous fifth decision, not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East. We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it.
So, here's another view. So here we have two opposite sides of the coin in one sense, but there are some other dimensions to this, of course. You know, what's really going on in all of this, and you know, on one level, is this really a question about the nature of the deal? Could the negotiations have been better, tougher, harder in the context of sunset clauses, or in terms of areas that the deal did not touch, like the ballistic missile program that Iran is allowed to keep and engage in tests? Or could somehow the deal have included some kind of guarantees about how some people see Iran's behaviour in the wider region, i.e. some kind of grand bargain with the Iranians that might have helped deal with these questions as well? Now, people who've been involved in negotiations before will probably tell you that the wider you make the negotiation, the more difficult it is to come to a deal. And while I won't necessarily take a position on any and all of these, but I will say that the evidence comes down on saying, in the context of the narrow band of dealing with Iran's nuclear program, the deal has been successful and moved Iran from a space it was in 2012, where today has delayed for a number of years its ability to create a bomb. Okay? Now, of course, it doesn't deal with the ballistic missile program, and it also doesn't deal with the unfolding landscape in the region and what Iran's position will be in Syria after the dust settles. In the Syrian conflict, there is an end in sight here. We'll talk about that perhaps in question time. The Iran relationship with Hezbollah, what this means for Israel, these are all legitimate questions, and the Russians, who are deeply engaged in Syria, talking through these questions with Israel as we speak. I would argue that in the case of Yemen, that in fact this question of Iranian interference is much overblown, and that the essence of the Yemeni crisis is actually not about Saudis stopping Iranian influence on their southern borders, but is actually an existential conflict between the Zaidi Houthi in the north and the Saudis that has been going on for decades and is at the centre of resolution of the Yemeni conflict. And again, Iranian influence there very, very limited. But these are all issues that await to play out, and we'll see how they do go. And there is, of course, that question of what happens to the regional balance of forces if indeed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action plays out, sanctions are lifted, and survive what is a fairly strong attack on them right now. And what will this mean in terms of Iran's economy and its ability to project influence in the region? In terms of the straight balance of forces, there's been a lot of work done on this. A couple of years ago, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, Anthony Kordsman, worked on a 600-page document. I've got the front cover up there, which looked at the balance of forces between the Gulf states, the US, Israel versus Iran, weapon system for weapon system, gun for gun, ship for ship, etc., and found that overwhelmingly the balance of forces in a security sense was in Iran's favour. Now this doesn't take into account, of course, proliferation questions and if the Iranian program were to be halted, diverted, or for the Iranians to actually withdraw from the JCPOA, which they don't seem to be inclined to do. But if sanctions are applied to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council and they're unable to reap the benefits of opening up their economy, then there is a pathway where they might actually withdraw. So if it's not about the balance of forces, though, then what is it about? So this is the view from Iran. And here we've got a slide up there of the President Rouhani's first cabinet, who of course made the deal with President Obama. They are at homecoming week, in fact. Just kidding. But he's a cabinet of the probably the most educated cabinet in any country around. Most of them with PhDs and masters from American universities, including this one. But from the Iranian perspective, clearly they see that there's a concerted effort to wind back the JCPOA. And they say, look around the region and what's been happening since the end of the Arab Spring. This is fundamentally an existential Sunni crisis. The Sunni countries were the most impacted. ISIS is Sunni, Al-Qaeda is Sunni. The Gulf states are at war with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Sunni. The Gulf states blockading Qatar, which is a Sunni crisis. And from the Iranian perspective, they did invade Iraq and Afghanistan. But they also see, betting short odds on the survivability of the Gulf Arab monarchies moving forward in the context of all of these challenges to them. So that is the view from Iran. But I just want to mention that there's something else that's going on here that's happening outside the political realm and the military realm, the security realm, as it were, which is, I would make the case to you, that there is actually a Shia renaissance happening. And it's happening culturally in the sort of following waves. And here we have the tomb of Imam Hussein in Karbala in southern Iraq, which is where, after the holy month of Muharram, which follows the end of the Islamic calendar, the Shia faithful gather and converge to commemorate the Imam Hussein. And this ceremony, which had been largely quarantined, suppressed under Saddam Hussein, has been slowly growing in size post-2003, where Shia adherents from Pakistan, Central Asia, Africa, Iran, Lebanon, across the region, Saudi Arabia, converge, and particularly for Arba'een, which is the 40th day of commemoration after the month of Ashura begins. And this year it's falling on the 9th of November. Now, according to their figures, the numbers that have been attending this ceremony, their figures, this is coming from among the Shia community, have seen this festival grow, commemoration rather, you know, to 18 million last year, 20 million this year. And it's hard to, you know, get accurate numbers on this, but to put it into a little bit of context, the annual Hajj to Saudi Arabia, which is opened up to all, you know, all Muslims, usually gets about 1.8 million during the Hajj period. So there's, for sure, in my own mind, I was in Iraq a year ago at this time, and in 2008, 2009, watching this grow. I'm not sure it's 20 million that are going to be there this year, but it's certainly the millions that are making their way. And it's quite a... And I'll show a couple of video clips from last year.
For this year, black-clad mourners have swept through Iraq's holy city of Karbala. Millions of Muslims from all around the world have converged on the city for special religious ceremonies held in remembrance of Imam Hussein on his martyrdom anniversary. Press TV's Altaf Ahmed reports from Karbala, where the holy shrine of the third Shia Imam is located.
The streets of Karbala flooded with millions of black-clad mourners, their eyes ringing with tears as they run in the blazing heat, some for miles, others barefoot. They run to the shrine of the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad and third Shia Imam, Imam Hussein. Here in Iraq, this run is known as the Run of Tuwairij. The years-old tradition symbolizes the rise of devout followers to answer the call of their Imam, who was once outnumbered on the plains of Karbala, now hidden under tall buildings.
Any human being who seek a freedom should be look for Imam Hussein and that's why we come here. Karbala and Muharram is an important month for us, especially the day Ashura, when he sacrificed himself and his family just for a right cause.
Under the reign of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid ibn Muawiyah, the Muslim community in the Arabian Peninsula had been plagued with injustice and cruelty. Imam Hussein took a stand against this tyrant and led a revolt calling for reform in the nation of his grandfather, Prophet Muhammad. He was challenged by Yazid's army of tens of thousands. The Imam's army, however, was made of tens of family members and companions. He was brutally killed along with 72 of his companions. People from all over the world have come here to renew their vow of allegiance and to pay homage to the martyred Imam.
This year we received tens of thousands of people from all over the globe, from neighboring Arab countries, from the Islamic Republic of Iran, Pakistan, and so on. We've taken necessary measures to receive the masses.
Muharram commemorations reached their peak on the day of Ashura. The event is a million-man event and requires a high level of alertness from security officials.
Over 1400 years have passed, but the ripple effect of Imam Hussein's legacy seems to only grow bigger and bigger. The Ashura is considered to be one of the largest religious events here in Iraq. The countdown for Arba'een, an even bigger event, has begun. Arba'een marks the passing of 40 days after the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Altaf Ahmed, Press TV, Karbala.
Muharram morning processions are underway in Iraq's holy city of Karbala. Karbala is home to the shrines of the third Shia Imam, Imam Hussein, and his brother Abul Fazl al-Abbas. Each year on the nights of Muharram, thousands of mourners gather in caravans known as mawakib. They march between the two holy shrines to pay homage to the third Shia Imam and his brother. The commemorations draw participants from all over the world who stress Imam Hussein's message is not only for Muslims.
His message was not only Islamic, but it was a universal message. His message can be, what he fought for, can be used And if it is used today in the world, it can bring peace to the world. Because he fought against racial discrimination when he brought around people from all over the places. He fought against religious discrimination when he had Christians joining him.
There's an Islamic message to it, absolutely. But the fact that he was out there with different races, different kinds of people, different ages of people, different genders of people, that shows that Imam Hussein's message was a lot more than most people understand today.
Imam Hussein has inspired many of the youth today to get creative and try to spread the values he stood for in their own way. One of the pioneer groups which came into the spotlight for doing so in recent years is the non-profit organization known as Who is Hussein, which promotes awareness about the life and legacy of the martyred Imam.
One of the things what Who is Hussein is trying to do very hard is that it is not a religious movement, it is more of an educational movement, where we're trying to educate people about Hussein and what he stood for, and what he sacrificed himself and his family for.
Each year, millions of Muslims all around the world mark the tragic martyrdom of Imam Hussein and 72 of his companions who were killed in the epic battle of Karbala in 680 AD. Imam Hussein led a revolution against the second Umayyad Caliph and tyrant of his time, Yazid ibn Muawiyah. He sought to alleviate oppression and reform the nation of his grandfather, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad.
Though Imam Hussein is still alive in the hearts and minds of millions who regard him as a revolutionary figure whose legacy has surpassed the boundaries of both place and time. Altaf Ahmed, Press TV, Karbala.
So this is actually changing the complexion of parts of Iraq. Okay, so as it increases, particularly in the south, it's also banners, the advertising in Baghdad, etc., commemorating Imam Hussein. It is having a huge impact, and it's scaring the Sunni communities about what they see as fundamental changes in their communities. And there is a proselytizing function. Some of these young men are part of these groups that go out. I've met some of the people who've been part of these proselytizing activities in Central Asia, etc., like other religions do, by the way. It's growing, and it's got a number of very interesting strands to it. I would argue that one of the impacts in Iran of being a theocracy since 1979 is that overwhelmingly it's turned most of the people in a secular direction. And this is something I think that requires more attention. It's a very, very young demographic and a very, very large country. And what's happening with these ceremonies is that the clerics and the clergy feel like they're losing control. And the secular youth are actually participating in these ceremonies for fun, and are starting to modify the rituals in their own way, painting their fingernails with Imam Hussein's face, writing rap music, songs about Imam Hussein. The eulogists, this branch of what used to be a job with the clergy, where you would sing beautiful songs in commemoration of Imam Hussein, have been almost privatised and taken over by really, really popular singers who sing beautifully and croon, and they've got 10 different TV channels that you can watch in Lebanon now, and Iraq and Syria and Iran, listening to these songs, and it's got very little to do with what the clerics want, but it's a nationalistic expression among the youth in particular, which seen as heretical in other branches of Islam.
الشمس علي، القمر علي، الكواكب علي، النجم علي، الأفلاك علي، السماء علي، الأرض علي، كفى إلا علي ولا سيف إلا ذو الفكار، مشينا تحت القصف ومشينا تحت النار، حسن حسين عباس وعلي، علينا مشينا وينك يا مولاي يا إمام نور العين، أنت غالي يا أبو الحسن والحسين، علي ولي الله وللسعيد الغدير، أنت وعد محمد يا شهيد الكبير، مين فتح بخيبر من نجح السطرين، عبد الإمام علي الأمير المؤمنين، الغزير في النور والقوة في الأسد، حررنا الحرية ونسينا العزم، فإن حسب الله هم الغالبون، يا إمام الحبيب نحن قادرون.
الشيعة وأصل الوالي يستاهل الكرار لحظة إن علي وأنا سيطر الناس الفقار
Heaven forbid turning religion into fun.
Peter, you're singing in Turkish.
Is he?
Sit in your own diets. We are in your own. Here's Zaman. Yeah, forever.
Good. So, this of course is haram in other places, and is a big issue. So, but how do you qualify this and bring this into the real politics of the day? Young, powerful country that has been hegemon in the past, that's changing. That has to be dealt with in some way, and how to deal with the insecurities and fears of the other communities who see this. And this is a big challenge, and what predominantly a challenge for the Iranians, in my view, to temper in some way or extend, how they're approaching some of these issues. It would be a good thing. Now, it's not just cultural, of course. There's been a couple of strategic things play out in the region in the last 10 days, separate to all of this, which is in Iraq, which is after ISIS was defeated in Mosul and Fallujah, the Kurds, Iraqi Kurds, went ahead under the direction of Masoud Barzani to conduct a referendum in which, unsurprisingly, all the Iraqi Kurds, while there was some big disagreement among them whether to do this, ultimately came out and voted to separate from Iraq. And this was despite Iran, Turkey, Security Council, everyone saying don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. They went ahead and did it. And what happened? Well, what happened basically was that Iraqi Kurdistan has two main factions: the UK, based in Sulaymaniyah under the Talibanis, Imam Jalal just passed, and Masoud Barzani, who has the KDP and the western side. Qasim Sulaymaniyah, who's the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Command, was able to basically reach out to a branch of the Talabani family, Hero Talabani, the wife of Imam Jalal, and convince them to separate themselves from the KDP and allow the Iraqi army, Shia militias and Iraqi police to move into Kirkuk, and then quickly fan out across all the disputed areas which run from the Syrian border down to the Iran border, and secure all of these areas back under the control of the central government. And what it means for the future, essentially, arguably, is two regions in Iraqi Kurdistan. One that will come under Iranian influence, one that could come under the influence of Turkey. In historical terms about where the Iraqi Kurds are at, this has put them back at least prior to 2003, and even, you could argue earlier, maybe civil war days in the mid-1990s, when these two branches formed. So that's not cultural influence. That's having a view of a direction of Iraq and being able to sell it and have it implemented by the Iraqis. And of course Turkey's in the same position either side. I'm not taking a political judgment here, it's just this is how it's played out, and that's a really big change. And I think what it means essentially is that Turkey and Iran are here. They are going to be critical for everything moving forward, and I think they're going to commit to the nation-state, international borders, etc. And this will have an impact in Syria as well moving forward. So that's beyond the cultural side. I'd just like to conclude with a final slide. So normally the gentleman sitting here to the left of the young lady, Yusuf Otaiba, who's the Emirati ambassador to Washington, is normally more sartorially disposed. very smart dresser, and but he's forgotten the first rule of diplomacy, which is discretion. And using your Hotmail account to conduct a semi-official business is not a good idea. Now, of course, there's been this flurrying series of leaks over the summer in relation to just about everything I've spoken about, almost, to the point where, someone's hacked email account has become almost a sort of permanent part of political life these days. Gosh, there's a lesson there for all of us, isn't there? And some of these leaks were essentially along the following lines, that there was serious talk in May and June about overthrowing the Qatari royal family. And the Emirates are still actually bankrolling a rival branch of the family in London, and this is reverberating within Doha and Qatar itself. The nature of the relationship between the Emirates and Saudi, they're drawn together perhaps in ways that may not necessarily endure moving forward. So anyway, I've hoped you've had an interactive experience today, and I'm delighted to take any questions. Thank you.
Peter, my mouth got a little ahead of my mind, but that was Turkish language they were singing. And the distinction here, I think, the initial videos, whatever, focused on the martyrdom of Hussein as the linchpin of the Shia faith. And suddenly, your video switches to Ali, who is important to the Shia. Please, if there are any Shia here, correct me, but doesn't occupy the central figure, that the central position that Hussein is. On the other hand, in Turkey, you've got a large minority, maybe 20% of the population, that is Alevi. Yes. In other words, a quasi-Shia, not at all like Iranian Shias, but anyway, a non-Sunni sect that worships Ali. And so perhaps it's no surprise that that section of your video was being sung in Turkish. But I wonder who produced it. Was it a Turkish production, or was it an Iranian effort to propagandize the Alevi population in Turkey? If you have any information.
Oh no, that's a great question, but what I will say is that I can show you and draw your attention to about 100 other different rap songs about Imam Hussein and other figures, in Shia theology. This is real. It's popular. I've got students on campus that listen to it. Well, I guess they're having fun in a way. They're enjoying it. But this is not something that's available, I would argue, on within Wahhabi adherents and the when one of the big criticisms in a sort of sectarian nature of some of the conflicts in the region is that the Shia are accused of being shrine worshippers and venerating Imam Hussein and Ali and others over the Prophet, God, etc. And this is part of the Sufi Sunni tradition also, which has been under attack across the Maghreb and elsewhere. So my point here, Frank, is thanks for pointing that out. I can show you some more rap videos. But I mean, people are using popular culture here in really stirring and interesting ways. I could show you another one quite separately, which is Julia Boutros, who's the Lebanese singer who sings songs of Nasrallah's letters and speeches in Beirut, with the National Symphonic Orchestra behind her. And you know, it's a letter from Nasrallah to the troops on the front line in the 2006 war against Israel. And the crowd goes wild. They're dancing in their seats. I mean, it's cultural celebration coming together. What we've all got to figure out is what this means in day-to-day politics and exchanges. I have one over here and then two down here. Ma'am, you for today.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the referendum that happened recently. So how much do you think that the relationship between the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds in Syria have impacted the reaction to the referendum in terms of anxieties like Iran feels? So of course in Turkey there's been kind of the ongoing civil war against the Kurds in the south, and then with Kobani and sort of the open borders more or less, where many fighters from Turkey are going into Syria, how much has that solidarity and that sort of almost beginning of a nationhood in a more tangible way compared to the past, how much has that, do you think, impacted the recent reaction to the referendum such that people, you know, they actually went into Kirkuk and reclaimed the oil fields? So I would like to know the relationship.
Yeah, no, very good. So I spent 3 months a year ago, September through December, going to Kirkuk, Erbil, Sulaymaniyah, Kirkuk, along the Syrian border, Baghdad, to look at transitional governance arrangements after ISIS had been kicked out of Mosul and elsewhere. And what struck me for the first time was how divided the Kurds were. So you had the PUK and the KDP at each other's throats. The PUK were concerned that Masoud Barzani in particular had mismanaged the economy, was running a one-party state. Parliament hadn't met for 2 years. You had the Kurdish PKK in control of Mount Sinjar on the Syrian border, sometimes with or without Rahaba Kurds from Syria, but with a strict aim of denying the space to the KDP Peshmerga. And there was great cynicism among the population about Kurdish independence because their salaries of the people hadn't been paid for 2 years, while the senior echelons, particularly the KDP, had a lot of money, and the corruption was a real issue. So, and there were street demonstrations, etc. So the question was, people were saying, they're not going to go ahead with this referendum because they're in such a position of weakness. And I said, no, they will. Or rather, Masoud Barzani will. Because he's 71 years of age. He feels like he's the father of Kurdish nationalism. And he had two possible choices. It's like, do I go the reform route and restart parliament, hope to become president again, try and bring all the factions together, or do I take the revolutionary route and go for the referendum and hope for the best? And that's literally what he did. And this could actually end his demise, signal his demise in Kurdish politics once and for all. I don't know how he's going to come back from that. There was, I think, not just scepticism in the Kurdish street, but among the Baghdad politicians about the sort of relative balance of forces, that they could split the Kurds at any time they wanted to, and which is what ultimately transpired. Now, there's no solidarity in my view between Iraqi Kurdistan, PKK, and then whatever emerges eventually along the northern borders with Turkey. Because I think from the Turkish perspective, they'll seek to continue to manage the economic relationship with the KDP and however that pans out, but will always step in and prevent that coagulation.
Thank you. Regarding Qatar,
sorry, regarding Qatar, yes.
How do you see that being resolved? If the U.S. is involved diplomatically, it is a backdoor motion. And what impact, if any, do you see it having on the U.S. naval?
Great. So the question was, you know, what with this blockade against Qatar, what's the prospect for resolution of it between and among the Gulf states? Is the US involved in any behind-the-scenes mediation? And what impact does this have for the very large US base in Qatar? Well, I think the first point here is that it's a very real split. In terms of face, you know, the nature of what happened and how it transpired, to climb back down. I mean, this is a real. You know, they're talking about getting rid of a branch of the ruling family. So you've got to balance it, though, I think, against the sort of there are genuine, you know, pluses if Qatar could come back together and move into the fold with Saudi and the Emirates. And the pluses are, frankly, that they've all made investments in infrastructure and oil and gas and trains and highways that, you know, could and should connect them all, where they could expand on the sort of Dubai Emirati model and actually collectively do away with their politics and work in a coherent fashion. But I suspect it's going to take some time to emerge. Everyone's been trying to mediate behind the scenes. But what's interesting is that very quickly, how isolated the Saudis and Emiratis have become in this blockade. So the Europeans, Turkey, Iran, the US has just said, sort it out. But it's a real, you know, ongoing emerging crisis. The longer it goes on, I think the stronger actually Qatar in some ways becomes, notwithstanding this is having quite a huge impact economically. They're having to import their food, their national currency, they've had to shore it up. But it could also drive Qatar in directions that towards Iran or towards Turkey, which is what's happening in ways.
Is the blockade having any impact on it?
It's having a big impact in terms of the price of food which is being imported. It's you know, impacting foreign direct investment into Qatar. There's you know, there are real issues there. Now, what's interesting though is that I don't think the US has been talking about removing the major air base that they have there, although that has been encouraged by Saudi and the Emiratis as well. So I think the US position is, let's hope they sort it out. This isn't helpful, but to no avail until now. Thank you.
I'm not as informed as the first gentleman who spoke, but it would be helpful to me if you could sort of comment on if there are any ideological similarities, sort of set up a chart between Taliban, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and then where Shia and Sunni identified with each of those, and what countries, which one is most influential.
So, I mean, I think the question here is, are co-religionists similarly inclined in policy terms right across the region, from Afghanistan to Israel-Palestine, right?
I'm really confused.
You're not the only one. No, really, my point here is that all of the alignments that happen here are about policy and politics. It's not. It's at the end of the day, it's not a sectarian. Just because you're Shia or you're another sect or you're Sunni, it doesn't necessarily follow that you're going to follow what all your co-religionists are doing. And it's on a case-by-case basis right across the region. And you've got to look at the local context every time.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this day of events honoring Ambassador Christopher Stevens and celebrating the Stevens Program for Middle Eastern Studies.